while Romania erupted in revolt. Its cities burning with chants of freedom. Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu were running out of places to hide. For 24 years, they had ruled like monarchs draped in the language of socialism, a couple who had built their image on fear, loyalty, and the relentless machinery of propaganda. But by December 1989, the facade had collapsed. The streets no longer bowed to them, they cursed them. The army no longer saluted, they turned their guns. This is not just the day Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu died. This is the day Romania crossed a point of no return. Christmas in blood. On the morning of 22nd December, as the revolution closed in on Bucharest, the Ceausescus fled the Central Committee building by helicopter, heading toward the countryside. They thought they were escaping. In truth, every road now led to the same place, a barracks in Târgoviște, and the wall that would end them. The escape unraveled quickly. Their helicopter pilot claimed anti-aircraft fire was a risk, forcing them to land on a roadside. They flagged down cars, switched drivers, and listened to the radio as state-controlled media fell into revolutionary hands. Every announcement, every cheer from the streets, pressed into Nicolae's ears like an insult. He spat out his fury, calling it a coup. But his words could not reverse the tide. Soldiers were already hunting them. By nightfall, they were locked inside a small office at an agricultural center. In the morning, armed troops from a local garrison took them into custody. They were no longer Romania's rulers. They were prisoners. Inside the newly formed National Salvation Front, debate raged, not about if they would be executed, but how soon. General Victor Stanculescu, once Ceausescu's own defense minister, wanted it finished without delay. Gelu Voican Voiculescu agreed. Ion Iliescu, the provisional president, called for a trial, though what passed for a trial would be a shadow of justice. Late on Christmas Eve, Stanculescu sent the coded order to the Târgoviște garrison. Recourse to the method. In plain words, it was time. Overnight, a 10-member extraordinary military tribunal was assembled, all of them military judges. The firing squad had already been chosen from a group of paratroopers handpicked that morning. Even the place of execution had been marked, a section of the barracks wall where the bullets would meet them. On Christmas morning, prominent lawyer Nicolae Ceaușescu was at home having breakfast when the phone rang. He was told to report immediately. He would defend Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu. He had never met them. He was given 10 minutes with his clients before proceedings began. 10 minutes to prepare for a case whose sentence was already written. At 5:30 a.m., they arrived at the garrison command office in Târgoviște. There was no courthouse, no grand chamber of justice, only a hastily arranged room inside a military compound. This was the Exceptional Military Tribunal, a drumhead court-martial created by the National Salvation Front, Romania's new ruling power. Its purpose wasn't to seek truth. It was to deliver a verdict before the world could ask questions. Ceaușescu suggested that their only slim chance was to plead insanity. Nicolae dismissed the idea. He refused to recognize the court at all, calling it unconstitutional, claiming it was nothing but a Soviet conspiracy. Elena stood beside him, defiant, her arrogance unshaken even as the walls closed in. The trial was over in less than an hour. The charges, genocide, undermining the national economy, and amassing wealth while the people starved, were read aloud. The state accused them of 60,000 deaths. Nicolae scoffed, interrupting, waving the words away as lies. Elena shouted over the judges, mocking the proceedings. They refused to sign any confession, refused to acknowledge the tribunal's authority. It didn't matter. The verdict had been decided before the first word was spoken. Guilty, sentence, death by firing squad. There was no appeal, no waiting period. The soldiers were already outside. The couple was led into the barracks courtyard, hands tied. Snow clung to the ground in patches, the air sharp with winter cold. They were pushed against the wall, Nicolae still shouting about treason, Elena protesting that she had raised children for the nation. 2 helicopters brought in members of an elite paratroop regiment to perform the execution. Captain Ionel Boiru, Sergeant Major Georgian Octavian, Doran Marian Kurlan, and 5 others prepared their weapons. 4 soldiers bound the couple's hands. Nicolae muttered bitterly, "We could have been shot without having this masquerade." Elena screamed at her captors, cursing them as they dragged her outside into the cold winter air. The firing squad formed a line. Some soldiers gripped their rifles tighter than others. A brief command was given. No speeches, no ceremony. Nicolae began singing a fragment of the Internationale, the old socialist anthem, his voice unshaken even as the rifles were raised. Elena's defiance turned into rage. The order came. Automatic gunfire erupted in a violent storm, shredding the December silence. The television crew, meant to document the execution, caught only the final moments. The firing squad had acted too quickly. Later, Captain Boru claimed his rifle alone may have delivered the fatal shots. He had been the only one to switch to fully automatic fire, while some hesitated. In total, investigators later found more than 120 bullets in their bodies. It was 2:50 p.m. on December 25, 1989. The Ceausescus were dead. The Ceausescus crumpled to the ground, their bodies sprawled in the thin snow. The echoes of the shots rolled over the barracks like a grim final salute to a regime that had ruled with iron and fear. Within hours, footage of their bodies was broadcast across Romania. For a people who had endured decades of shortages, repression, and the suffocating cult of personality, it was the proof that the nightmare had ended. But the swiftness of the trial, the absence of real justice, left a shadow. It was not the clean break from tyranny that history books often crave. It was a reckoning carried out in the fever of revolution, quick and merciless. The Ceausescus had built their power on control, on the belief that they were untouchable. In the end, they were hunted, captured, judged, and executed in less than a week. Their fall was as sudden as it was absolute, a reminder that even the most entrenched dictators can be swept away when a nation decides it has had enough. But for Romania, Christmas 1989 was not a day of peace. It was a day when the snow turned red, and the last chapter of a dark era was written in bullets. The death and the doubt. The bodies were covered with canvas and flown to Bucharest. On 30 December, they were buried in Ghencea Cemetery. Even in death, they remained divisive. In 2010, their remains were exhumed for identification, confirming their burial site. Supporters still visit, leaving flowers, especially on Nicolae's birthday, 26th January. The images of their deaths, released in the West 2 days later and broadcast on Romanian television, shocked the world. The speed of the trial and execution drew heavy criticism. The United States openly stated its regret that the proceedings had not been public. Many saw it for what it was, a political necessity for the new regime, designed to remove any chance of a counter-revolution. Those who orchestrated the trial justified it with claims of urgency. Rumors swirled that loyalist forces were preparing to free the couple. Prime Minister Petre Roman admitted years later that the execution was rushed to prevent such a rescue. No proof of an imminent threat was ever found. The aftermath was equally grim. On the 1st of March 1990, Colonel Ghica Popa, the presiding judge of the tribunal, was found dead in his office. Officially, it was suicide. The Ceausescus became the last people executed in Romania. Within 2 weeks, capital punishment was abolished. In 2009, Ion Iliescu, who had led the National Salvation Front, called the trial quite shameful but necessary. Victor Stanculescu, the military man who oversaw the tribunal, admitted it had not been just, but claimed it had prevented Nicolae from being lynched in the streets. History has not been kind to the official narrative. Investigations have since described the trial as a mockery of justice, its genocide charge unproven, its financial accusations never substantiated. Prosecutors in later years suggested the new regime had deliberately created a psychosis of terrorism to justify its actions. In December 2018, nearly 3 decades after the revolution, former leaders of the National Salvation Front were indicted for crimes against humanity related to the deaths that occurred during the uprising, many of them after Ceausescu's fall. The execution, once portrayed as the final act of justice against a dictator, now stood as a reminder that revolutions, too, can be born in darkness. On that cold Christmas afternoon in 1989, the world witnessed the violent end of a regime, but not the clean triumph of justice. What took place inside that cramped military room was less a trial than a reckoning, one delivered not by law, but by the weight of vengeance and fear. The Ceausescus died defiant, convinced history would see them as martyrs. For Romania, the truth would prove far more complicated. But the real question is, why? Why did Romania execute its dictator on live TV? To find the answer, we need to step back in time. The rise of a dictator. While much of Europe's 20th century history is written in the blood of battles and the rise and fall of nations, some of its most dangerous figures were not born into power. They were shaped by hardship, anger, and an unshakable hunger for control. Nicolae Ceaușescu was one of them. His story began far from palaces or political halls. It began in the mud of a poor Romanian village, where the seeds of a ruthless future were sown long before the world knew his name. He was born in Scornițești, a small, wind-beaten settlement in Olt County. Official records argue over the exact date, January 23rd, 1918, or perhaps January 26th, but the year marked the end of a world war and the beginning of another kind of struggle. He was the third of 9 children, son to a strict and deeply religious father who owned barely 3 hectares of land and a few sheep. The family's survival relied on hard labor, and young Nicolae's hands were set to work early, sewing clothes to help feed so many mouths. At school, he was bright enough to rank near the top of his class, but he did not stay there long. At 11, he left the village for Bucharest. To some, it looked like ambition. Others whispered he had fled from an abusive home. Whatever the truth, the boy who left Scornițești never really came back the same. In the capital, he apprenticed under Alexandru Sandulescu, a shoemaker and an underground communist. The workshop was more than a place to stitch leather. It was a place where forbidden ideas were sown into the minds of young workers. Ceausescu joined the illegal Communist Party in 1932, still just a teenager. At first, he carried out minor tasks, but his real education came from the streets, in protests, in strikes, and in prison cells. By 15, he had already been arrested for street fighting during a strike. By the mid-1930s, he had been detained multiple times, accused of distributing anti-fascist propaganda and organizing dissent. The secret police labeled him a dangerous communist agitator. They were right. In June 1936, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison, additional months for contempt, and forced residence in his home village. But confinement only hardened him. Prison became his political classroom. In the wartime years, he was shuttled between notorious jails, Jilava, Caransebeș, Vacaresti, before finally landing in Târgu Jiu internment camp in 1943. There, fate put him in the same cell as Gheorghe Gheorghiu Dej, the future leader of communist Romania. Ceausescu became his protege, his loyal enforcer. Within the prison walls, self-criticism sessions broke men's spirits. Those who resisted were met with Ceausescu's fists. In those cramped, grim barracks, he learned that fear could be as powerful as ideology. When the Red Army entered Bucharest in 1944, the Romanian Communist Party moved quickly to seize power. Ceausescu, freed from prison, became secretary of the Union of Communist Youth. By 1948, he had been appointed secretary of the Ministry of Agriculture, and within a year, without a shred of military background, deputy minister of the armed forces. He rose fast, promoted to lieutenant general and head of the army's higher political directorate. His loyalty to Gheorghe Dej placed him in the heart of the home communist faction, those who had stayed in Romania rather than fleeing to Moscow during the war. In these years, Ceausescu's name became tied to one of the darkest domestic campaigns in post-war Romania: forced collectivization. Between 1949 and 1952, over 80,000 peasants were arrested, 30,000 of them imprisoned. The state seized private land, crushing resistance. In Vadu Rosca, military units opened fire on farmers who dared defy the regime. 9 lay dead. 48 were wounded. 18 more would be jailed under Ceausescu's direct investigation. When Gheorghe Dej died in March 1965, the party was fractured. Older, more experienced officials tore at each other for control, leaving Ceausescu as the compromise candidate. On March 22nd, he was named General Secretary of the Communist Party. In just 2 years, he had also taken the post of head of state. At first, he seemed different. He eased censorship, challenged Moscow, and even condemned the 1968 Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia in a speech that electrified the nation. The West welcomed him as a maverick communist. He visited Washington, London, and Paris, shaking hands with leaders who hoped to find in him a softer face for Eastern Europe. But the image was a carefully constructed mask. Beneath it, Ceausescu had already begun reshaping Romania in his own image. His dream was not freedom, but control. Total, unyielding control. He admired Mao Zedong and Kim Il-sung, not for their revolutions, but for their ability to dominate every aspect of their nation's lives. In 1971, after touring China and North Korea, he returned with his own blueprint, the July Theses. It was a manifesto for ideological saturation, political indoctrination in schools, youth forced into state projects, the press and the arts brought under militant propaganda. It was the birth of his personality cult. By 1974, Ceausescu had crowned himself president of the Socialist Republic of Romania, merging party and state into a single organism, one with him at its brain and its beating heart. Every law, every decree, every decision flowed from him. The parliament met rarely, and when it did, it was only to approve what he had already decided. But his control reached into the most private corners of Romanian life. In 1966, he had issued Decree 770, outlawing abortion and contraception in an effort to swell the population. Doctors became enforcers, monitoring women's pregnancies. Divorce became nearly impossible. Mothers of 10 or more children were declared heroines of the state. The policy filled orphanages with unwanted children, many suffering from neglect and illness. To Ceausescu, they were not lives, they were statistics, proof of his demographic victory. By the late 1970s, his Romania was a paradox. On the surface, industrial growth, healthcare expansion, and new universities suggested progress. Salaries rose, education was free, and foreign leaders still toasted him at state dinners. But underneath, the country's culture was suffocating. The July Theses had rolled back intellectual freedom, reinstating censorship and ideological conformity. Literature, theater, even ballet became tools of the regime's propaganda machine. The man who had once defied the Soviet Union now ruled Romania with a paranoia that rivaled the worst of Stalin's years. The political prisons were never empty. Dissenters disappeared. and the cult of Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu grew so large it blotted out the rest of the nation. Their portraits hung in classrooms and factories. Their speeches were broadcast daily. Children learned songs praising them before they learned history. What began in the dirt streets of Scornicești had become an empire built on fear. And as the years went on, one truth became clear. Nicolae Ceaușescu had not simply risen to power, he had made himself inseparable from it. For him, there would be no Romania without Ceausescu, and no Ceausescu without Romania. It was a belief that would one day lead to his downfall. But in these years, the years of his unchallenged rule, it was the iron spine of a dictatorship that seemed unbreakable. And for the millions living beneath it, the shadow of that dictatorship stretched into every home, every school, and every whispered conversation in the dark. When the crowd turned, it began with oil, and with the illusion that oil could buy power forever. In 1973, the Arab oil embargo sent prices soaring across the globe. While the West scrambled for fuel, Romania found itself at the edge of an unexpected opportunity. Nicolae Ceaușescu, the man who ruled the country with a clenched fist, saw more than a chance for profit. He saw a way to rewrite Romania's destiny. Ceausescu's vision was vast. Romania would become Europe's oil refining capital, not just processing its own crude, but the oil of Iraq, Iran, and beyond, then selling it at high margins on the lucrative Rotterdam spot market. It was a dream dressed in steel and concrete, in towering refineries and endless pipelines. But dreams need money, and Romania did not have it. Instead of using the windfall from the oil boom to build, Ceausescu poured millions into aid for third world nations, chasing influence abroad. The refineries would be built with Western loans, taken under the assumption that oil profits would pay them back many times over. Then came 1977. A devastating earthquake tore through Bucharest, crippling the plan before it could take shape. By the time the refineries were completed in the early 1980s, the oil market had collapsed. The profits he had promised never arrived. The debt, however, remained. But Ceausescu's troubles were no longer just economic. In August 1977, more than 30,000 miners in the Jiu Valley rose in defiance. Low pay, brutal working conditions. Their demands were simple. They wanted their leader to face them. When Ceausescu arrived on the third day of the strike, he expected obedience. Instead, he was met with shouts of, "Down with the red bourgeoisie!" The scene echoed the defiance of Poland's striking workers years before. The strike ended with promises, but promises in Ceausescu's Romania were dangerous. In the years that followed, its leaders began to die. Accidents, sudden illnesses. Whispers spread that Securitate doctors had given them lethal doses of radiation in the guise of medical exams, ensuring cancer would bloom in their bodies. Whether true or not, the fear it created was real. Still, Ceausescu maintained his image abroad. He shook hands with emperors, queens, and presidents. In 1978, he was welcomed in Washington, praised by US leaders. That same year, however, his regime was dealt a silent but devastating blow. Ion Mihai Pacepa, a general in the Securitate, defected to the United States, taking with him state secrets and a detailed account of the regime's inner corruption. Ceausescu's paranoia deepened. At home, he turned his attention to reshaping Romania itself. Inspired by a visit to North Korea, he began the systematization program, a plan to demolish villages and historic neighborhoods, replacing them with regimented blocks of flats. In the 1980s, whole sections of Bucharest were wiped from the map. Churches, monasteries, even hospitals were leveled to make way for his grandest project, the Palace of the Republic, an opulent monument to his power, surrounded by a newly constructed civic center. 8 square kilometers of history vanished under his orders. The money to build his dream came from loans, and by the mid-1980s, the weight of foreign debt was suffocating Romania. Ceausescu's solution was brutal. He would pay it all back, no matter the cost. Imports were slashed. Food, fuel, and electricity were rationed to the bone. Streetlights went dark. Families shivered through winters without heat. Shops stood empty, shelves bare. By 1989, Romania's foreign debt was gone, but so was any semblance of a normal life for its people. Resentment festered. In November 1987, in Brașov, it exploded. Workers from the Red Flag truck plant took to the streets, joined by thousands more from nearby factories. Their chants began with calls for bread, heat, and pay, but quickly turned to "Down with Ceausescu." The protest grew into a march through the city center, banners held high, the anthem of 1848 echoing through the streets. The regime's response was swift and merciless. By nightfall, security forces surrounded the city, breaking the protest with arrests and beatings. Officially, the uprising was dismissed as hooliganism. In reality, over 60 people were imprisoned, exiled to remote towns, or sent to work camps. Even students who showed solidarity were tracked, arrested, and expelled from their universities. The message was clear: resistance would be crushed, and memory of it erased. But memory cannot be erased so easily. By the winter of 1989, the winds of revolution sweeping Eastern Europe reached Romania. In November, Ceausescu, now 71, secured another 5 years as leader. Weeks later, protests erupted in Timișoara. They began with the attempted eviction of a Hungarian pastor, Laszlo Tokes, but quickly turned into a full-scale uprising. The Securitate army opened fire on unarmed crowds. Men, women, children, their blood stained the streets. Ceausescu was abroad in Iran when the first shots were fired. Upon his return, he called the revolt the work of foreign interference, denying the reality even as the dead were buried in secret. The people knew the truth. Word spread through forbidden radio broadcasts, whispered in breadlines and factories. On December 21st, Ceausescu staged a mass rally in Bucharest, meant to show unwavering support. But this time, the crowd did not obey the script. Shouts rose from the masses. The chant was not for the leader, it was against him. And for the first time in decades, Ceausescu's face betrayed something alien to him. Not arrogance, not fury, but fear. The walls that had kept Romania silent for so long were about to break.
Tovarăși și prieteni, cetățeni ai capitalei
Inside Ceausescu's final hours. In the winter of 1989, the streets of Bucharest carried a strange tension. For decades, Nicolae Ceaușescu had ruled Romania with an iron hand, his voice thundering from balconies, his speeches scripted and unchallenged. But on 21st December, the stage he had controlled for so long would become the scene of his undoing. That morning, the dictator stepped onto the balcony overlooking what is now Revolution Square. Below him, tens of thousands had gathered, as they always had, to hear the familiar words, praises for the socialist revolution, reminders of Romania's multilaterally developed socialist society. He condemned the unrest in Timișoara, blaming it on fascist agitators bent on destroying socialism. It was the same rhetoric he had used for years. But this time, something was different. 8 minutes into his speech, the first cracks appeared. A voice in the crowd, defiant, unshaken, shouted, "Timișoara!" Then another, and another. Boos rose like a tide, swallowing the sound of the loudspeakers. Ceausescu froze, his face caught in the camera's lens, his right hand lifted, searching for control, for the authority he once commanded effortlessly. He announced small reforms, an increase in the minimum wage, but the words fell into a sea of anger. The chants only grew louder. Inside the Central Committee building, the Ceausescus retreated. Outside, the city was shifting. Crowds gathered in University Square, confronting police and soldiers. Barricades were thrown up, and for hours, the streets pulsed with defiance. But the regime's machinery was still powerful. By midnight, security forces had cleared the streets, hundreds arrested, and silence returned, at least for the night. The next morning, the silence shattered. The rebellion had spread beyond Bucharest, reaching every major city. Then came the news that would seal the regime's fate. Vasile Milea, the defense minister, was dead. The official word was suicide. In truth, Milea had tried only to wound himself. The bullet had struck an artery. To the army, his death looked like murder, a warning from the top. Soldiers began abandoning the regime en masse, turning their weapons away from the people and toward the idea of freedom. Inside the Central Committee building, Ceausescu tried again to face the crowd. This time, stones and debris answered him. The once untouchable leader ducked back inside as demonstrators surged forward. Within minutes, he, Elena, and a small entourage climbed to the roof. A helicopter waited. They lifted off only seconds before the mob broke through the doors below. Their flight was desperate. The first stop was the Snagov residence, but the airspace was no longer theirs. Army orders grounded all flights. Forced to land near Targoviste, they were taken into custody by local police. Even then, the couple seemed to believe they could regain control, speaking as if their authority still held weight. The police, listening to the radio, knew otherwise. Within hours, the Ceausescus were handed over to the army, and the rest is history. Romania executed its dictator. The numbers of the dead from the uprising became another shadow over the revolution. In the days immediately after, Western newspapers spoke of tens of thousands killed by the Securitate. The reality was smaller, though no less tragic, under 1,000, according to hospitals across the country. Yet each number was a life cut short. The Communist Party of Romania vanished almost overnight. Unlike its counterparts in the former Soviet bloc, it would never return. The Ceausescus were buried quietly at Ghencea Cemetery, placed on opposite sides of a path. Their graves were plain, though flowers and old symbols of their power still appeared from loyalists. In later years, their children and supporters pushed for grand mausoleums or churches in their honor. The government refused. The couple had ruled for over 2 decades, their portraits once unavoidable, their presence absolute. In those final days, the myth shattered. What began as another speech in the square had turned into a nation's reckoning, a sudden, violent end to an era that had promised glory and delivered fear. And in the silence that followed the gunfire on that frozen Christmas day, Romania stepped, unsteady but unchained, into a future without them. And that's all for now. Drop your theories in the comments because I'm reading every single one. If you enjoyed going down this rabbit hole with me, hit that like button, share this with a friend who needs to know, and make sure you're subscribed with the bell on so you don't miss the next deep dive. Trust me, you're going to want to be here when the next twist drops.